Hello, family, and happy Easter holidays. So let's talk about obsession. Not the harmless kind, not the I like this show kind. I'm talking about the kind of obsession where entire media platforms wake up every single day and ask themselves, how can we drag Meghan today? Because apparently, that's a business model now. And just when you thought nobody inside that system would say anything, Charlene White walked in. Charlene White, from Loose Women, from Talking Royals, a woman who is not an outsider critic operating from the safe distance of a competing platform or a personal blog or an academic paper published in a journal nobody reads on a Tuesday afternoon. A woman who exists within the ecosystem, who has a seat at the table, who understands how the machine works because she has worked alongside it and within it and in proximity to it for long enough to know exactly what she's looking at. And she looked at the chaos and the noise and the relentless daily industrial-scale negativity directed at one specific person, and she said, clearly and without the hedge everything, qualify everything, make sure nobody gets too upset language that these environments tend to produce, this is hateful, and honestly, it's weird. Now, pause there, because those two words, hateful and weird, are doing an enormous amount of work in a very small space, and they deserve more attention than they typically receive before the conversation moves on to the next thing. Hateful is not the word you use when you're describing criticism. It's not the word you reach for when you're talking about robust debate or challenging commentary, or the kind of scrutiny that public figures reasonably expect, and that a functioning media landscape reasonably provides. Criticism is criticism. Scrutiny is scrutiny. These are words with specific meanings that describe specific things. Hateful is different. Hateful describes something that has moved beyond the territory of opinion or analysis and into something more primal, something that isn't really about the subject at all anymore, isn't really about what Meghan has done or said or decided, but about the emotional relationship the coverage has developed with its own target, the kind of coverage that would persist regardless of what she did, because it stopped being responsive to her actual behavior long ago and became self-sustaining, fed by its own momentum, justified by its own repetition. And weird, which sounds almost too casual, too conversational to carry real weight, is actually doing something very specific and very precise. Because weirdness, in this context, is about proportion, about the gap between the intensity of a reaction and any reasonable justification for it, about the particular strangeness of watching enormous energy, resources, airtime, column inches, and emotional investment get directed day after day at someone who, if you step back far enough to see the full picture, is simply a woman living her life. Not a head of state making decisions that affect millions of people, not a figure wielding institutional power with documented consequences for public welfare, not someone whose actions have produced verifiable, measurable harm requiring sustained journalistic investigation. A woman living her life, making choices about her family, her career, her home, her health, her values. Choices that, in virtually any other context applied to virtually any other person, would be entirely unremarkable. And the machine's response to those entirely unremarkable choices is, as Charlene White correctly identified, weird. The kind of weird that when you finally allow yourself to name it plainly, becomes impossible to unname. Now let's be precise about what Charlene White actually did, because it's easy to describe this as defending Meghan and leave it there, as though the significance is purely personal, as though this is about one woman standing up for another woman and the story begins and ends in that gesture. It doesn't. What Charlene White did goes considerably beyond defense. Defense would be responding to specific claims with specific counter-arguments. Defense would be addressing individual headlines and explaining why the reporting was inaccurate or unfair. Defense operates within the framework of the existing conversation, accepts its terms, engages with its structure, tries to shift the outcome while leaving the game itself intact. What Charlene White did was different. She stepped outside the framework. She looked at the conversation itself, not the individual claims within it, not the specific headlines or the particular segments or the rotating cast of royal experts delivering their verdicts, but the shape of it, the pattern, the system. And she named what she saw. She asked the question that the system is specifically designed to never have to answer. Why are so many people so deeply, so persistently, so emotionally invested in tearing down someone they have never met? That is not a question about Meghan. That is a question about the people doing the tearing, about the motivations behind it, about what need is being met by this particular form of sustained, directed negativity, about what it says, not about the target, but about the targeting, that it has continued for this long, at this intensity, with this level of institutional support. It's a genuinely uncomfortable question, the kind that tends to produce defensive reactions precisely because it doesn't have a comfortable answer. Because the comfortable answers, it's journalism, it's accountability, it's public interest, it's what happens to public figures, start to fall apart when you hold them against the actual content of the coverage, against the pronoun counts and the outfit analyses and the body language experts and the private jet sagas and the breathless daily cycle of stories about someone whose most consistent crime appears to be existing in a way that certain people find irritating. Public interest journalism investigates power. It asks hard questions of institutions and systems and individuals whose decisions affect other people's lives. It performs a democratic function, holds the powerful accountable, surfaces information the public needs to make informed decisions, creates transparency where powerful interests prefer opacity. Counting someone's pronouns is not that. Analyzing someone's curtsy is not that. Running daily negative headlines about someone's tone of voice or wardrobe choices or vacation destinations is not that. And the discomfort that Charlene White's question produced, the speed and intensity of the backlash, the defensiveness, the emotional volume of the response, tells you something important about how close to the bone that question actually lands. Because if the coverage were genuinely justified, if it were rooted in genuine public interest, applied through consistent and principled standards, producing content that a thoughtful person could defend on journalistic grounds, then someone saying, "Is this a bit much?" would register as mild and manageable, would prompt a considered response, would generate a calm, evidence-based explanation of why the scrutiny is proportionate and warranted. That is not what happened. What happened was loud, defensive, emotionally activated pushback of the kind that tends to emerge not when a criticism is wrong, but when it's accurate, when it names something that has been carefully not named, when it introduces into a conversation that has been running on comfortable assumption the specific discomfort of having to actually examine what you're doing and why. Reasonable positions don't tend to react that way to reasonable questions. Narratives being protected from scrutiny do. Now, let's talk about the pattern, the actual mechanical structure of how this works. Because understanding the loop, really understanding it in its component parts and its operational logic, is what makes Charlene White's disruption of it so significant. It starts with a story. Not necessarily a story that emerged from genuine investigation or that carries genuine public interest weight. It can be almost anything because at this stage of the process, the story is less important than the frame. The frame is always the same. Meghan did something, said something, was somewhere, wore something, or simply existed in a way that can be presented as problematic. The specifics are almost interchangeable. What matters is that the frame is applied. Then comes amplification. The story moves from its original platform, A tabloid, a blog, a social media account. Television segments are built around it. Panel discussions are convened. Royal experts with no discernible expertise and no verifiable access are booked to deliver verdicts. The story grows not because new information has emerged, but because each retelling adds another layer of apparent significance. By the time it is circulated through several platforms, something that began as nothing much has acquired, through repetition alone, the texture of something substantial. Then comes the outrage, which, and this is the part worth understanding clearly, is frequently not organic. It is generated. It is the predictable output of a specific kind of framing applied to a specific kind of audience that has been, through years of conditioning, primed to respond in exactly this way to this particular name. The outrage is the product, not the byproduct. It's what the system was designed to produce. And then the cycle completes itself. The outrage becomes the story. The media reports on the reaction it created. Commentary about the commentary. Debate about the debate. The original story, whatever it was, is now almost irrelevant. It has served its function. It generated enough heat to fuel another cycle. And Meghan, through all of this, without her participation, without her consent, without any meaningful mechanism for her to correct the record or contest the frame, remains the headline, the subject, the constant, the variable that never changes even as everything around her does. This is the machine Charlene White was describing when she used the word hateful. Not any single story, not any individual commentator, the machine itself. And here's what makes her decision to say so significant beyond the personal. She is inside it. Not a distant critic, not someone who has never navigated the specific pressures and incentives and unspoken rules of the British media environment. Someone who understands, from direct, sustained, professional experience, what it costs to deviate from the script. What happens when you don't perform the expected reaction. What the consequences tend to be when someone with a platform uses it to say something the ecosystem doesn't want said. She said it anyway, and that matters in a way that the same observation from an outsider wouldn't, because outsider criticism of a system can always be dismissed as ignorance, as misunderstanding, as the uninformed perspective of someone who doesn't grasp the complexities of how it actually works. Insider criticism doesn't have that exit available. Insider criticism has to be engaged with differently, has to be answered rather than simply dismissed, because the person making it cannot be positioned as someone who doesn't understand the territory. Charlene White understands the territory, and she looked at it and said, "This is not okay." There's another dimension to this that deserves attention because it sits underneath the conversation about media without always making it into the conversation explicitly. When you look at the history of Meghan's coverage, at the specific language used, the specific comparisons made, the specific aspects of her identity that have been consistently, repeatedly, and disproportionately emphasized, a pattern emerges that goes beyond ordinary bias, beyond the standard unfairness that any public figure might expect to encounter in a media landscape that values conflict over accuracy. The pattern has a texture. And the texture is familiar to anyone who has studied how race operates in British public life. Not always explicitly, not always in ways that produce legally actionable statements, or that create the kind of clear, undeniable evidence that makes denial impossible. But in the accumulation of framings, in the consistency of the language, in the particular aspects of Meghan's identity and behavior that get emphasized while equivalent behavior from people who don't share those aspects of her identity gets ignored or framed entirely differently. Charlene White, as a Black British woman working in British media, brings to this conversation a perspective that is not incidental. It is informed. It is grounded in a particular kind of knowledge about how these systems operate and what they tend to produce and who tends to bear the consequences. When she calls the coverage hateful and questions the intensity of the investment in Meghan's destruction, she is drawing on more than casual observation. She is drawing on the specific, embodied understanding of someone who has navigated the same spaces and who knows from the inside what certain kinds of coverage actually mean and what they tend to be about when they're about something more than what they claim to be about. And then there's the question of comedy, of satire, of the entertainment layer of this entire operation, which tends to get less scrutiny than the news layer because it hides behind the protective frame of humor. Satire is real, important, valuable. A functioning democracy needs the ability to mock its institutions and its powerful figures. The freedom to take aim at the high and mighty through comedy is not trivial. It's one of the mechanisms through which cultures process and challenge power. But satire is not a blanket immunity, and the distinction between clever, incisive comedy that illuminates something true and lazy, repetitive targeting that simply uses a person as a reliable punchline is not difficult to make if you're willing to look honestly. When the same person becomes the default joke, not because she has done something genuinely ridiculous or hypocritical or worth lampooning, but because her name attached to any negative framing reliably produces audience response, that's not satire doing its job. That's a content strategy wearing satire's clothes. That's the machine finding another format in which to run the same loop, this time with a laugh track. Charlene White called this out too. And in doing so, she identified something that rarely gets named in the conversation about media bias, that the entertainment layer of the targeting is not separate from the news layer. It reinforces it. It normalizes it. It gives permission for the next news cycle to be a little harsher, the next headline a little more extreme, the next commentary a little more comfortable with cruelty, because the cultural environment has been prepared by repeated exposure to the joke version of the same hostility. Normalization works through accumulation, through repetition, through the gradual, almost imperceptible raising of the threshold for what feels like too much. And Charlene White, by naming it, interrupted that accumulation, created a moment of pause in a cycle that is specifically designed to never pause. That's not nothing. In a media environment where the path of least resistance for everyone working within it is to not say this, to not risk the backlash, to not become the next target by defending the current one, choosing to say it anyway is a genuinely costly decision. And the cost was immediate. The backlash was fast. The defensive reaction was intense, which, as we have established, tells you considerably more about the accuracy of what she said than about whether she should have said it. Because here's what doesn't get said enough in these conversations. The people who push back hardest against the observation that something is hateful tend not to be people who have examined the coverage carefully and concluded that hateful is the wrong word. They tend to be people who have a stake in the narrative continuing, who have built something, a platform, a reputation, an audience, a career, on the foundation of a particular story about a particular person, and for whom the disruption of that story is not an abstract concern about journalistic standards or media ethics, but a very concrete threat to something they have invested in and depend on. That's the reaction Charlene White's words produced, not considered disagreement. Protectiveness, the specific, revealing protectiveness of people guarding something they cannot afford to have examined too closely. Which brings us to where this all lands. Not with a resolution, because the machine doesn't stop because one person names it on a television panel. The cycle continues. The headlines keep coming, the content loop keeps running, but something shifts. Not dramatically, not immediately, not in a way that produces its own satisfying headline or its own clean narrative of triumph. Something shifts in the way that real, durable change tends to shift. Quietly, incrementally, in the accumulation of moments where someone inside the system steps outside the script, where someone with a platform uses it to ask the question the platform was not designed to ask, where someone names the pattern in a space where the pattern has always been treated as background, as normal, as simply how things are. Each of those moments creates a small crack in the normalization, and cracks accumulate. And eventually, not today, not next week, not on a schedule that anyone can predict, the thing that was normalized stops being normal. The thing that was treated as inevitable stops being inevitable. The thing that was never questioned starts getting questioned by more people with more persistence in more spaces. That's where this is heading. Slowly, but heading there nonetheless. And Charlene White, by looking at a system she knows from the inside and saying clearly and without excessive qualification that what she sees is hateful and weird, moved it. Not far, but in the right direction, and in a conversation that has been running in the wrong direction for a very long time, that matters more than it might seem. Because once you see the pattern clearly enough to name it, you can't unsee it, and neither can anyone watching. Thank you for watching. Happy Easter holidays!